This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast.
Will ye gone tae Fordalbo, my bonny lassie ho? Will ye gone tae Fordalbo, my bonny lassie ho?
Hello, friends. Today we're talking about Appalachia's Scottish roots with Scotland native Jack Beck. Jack is a musician originally from Dunfermline who has toured all over Europe and the United States. He's also worked as a storyteller and a professor, so I always invite him to speak to my Appalachian dialects class when I teach it. So, this audio comes from his presentation with my class, which is going to explain why I sound a little bit different when I ask my questions. The sound is just a little bit different. Now, I first met Jack and his wife, Wendy Welch, when they opened a bookstore here in Big Stone Gap several years ago. And what a wonderful bookstore it was. They had weekly events for the community, music, games, food, and they had cats and kittens on occasion that were available for adoption. My kids were little at the time, and I brought them every chance I could because going to a used bookstore with cats is my idea of the very best day. Jack and Wendy, we still have our little Serafina kitty that we adopted from your bookstore, by the way. They met a lot of people over the years and they collected some stories, as you might imagine, which culminated in Wendy's best selling nonfiction book, The Little Bookstore of Big Stone Gap. And she and Jack have recorded music together as well. So Jack graciously gave me permission to share his talk and a song with you for this episode. I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, share the episode on social, and subscribe if you'd like bonus episode and early access. You can subscribe on Facebook or Patreon. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoy.
You'd be the floor of Endemol, my bonny lassie ho. There will be lords and ladies there.
I usually, when I'm doing anything like this, explain a bit about my background, just so you can tune into my accent. Although the funny thing is that when people around here say they like my accent, I tell them I don't have an accent. It's you guys that do. So yes, I'm from Scotland originally. I was born and lived most of my life in the town of Dunfermline, which is on the east coast of Scotland and just north of Edinburgh, the capital city. I was a professor in a college for over 20 years, nothing to do with music or English language or anything like that. It was all to do with construction. But Amy will know that you need something else in your life. If you're a teacher in a college, you need something else in your life to keep you sane. And for me, that was my interest in traditional songs and ballads, Scottish songs and ballads. So I hope you're tuned into my accent now. And I think I'll start off talking a bit about history. Now, I'm sure that I'll be overlapping with some stuff that Amy has told you as well. But it's always good to get, more than one view of these things. So this session is really about language more than anything else, and the connection between the Scottish language and the Appalachian dialect of English. I should say right away that people often think of Scots, the Scottish language, which is my native language, as being a dialect of English. It kind of is, but it's really a separate language of its own. It not only is related to English in the same way that maybe Portuguese and Spanish would be related, but not the same language, or the various Scandinavian languages, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, are obviously connected, but they're not the same language. And that's how I often think about English and Scots. There's a certain amount of overlap there, but there's an awful lot in the Scots language that comes from French, comes from German, comes from the Scandinavian languages that you wouldn't find in English. And obviously, as I'm speaking to you, I'm doing my very best to speak, standard English. I learned to do that many years ago when I started coming over here to America, to the US. And that was back in the late 1980s, and came every summer singing up and down the East Coast. And I learned fairly quickly that I had to slow down, not speak as quickly, to pronounce my words more carefully, and eventually learned that there was quite a lot in American English that is different from British English, from standard British English. So people talk often about something called code switching. Code switching is when you find yourself in a particular situation in a group of people, and you adapt your language so that you can be understood in that group of people. So, for instance, I'll be going back to Scotland this year, and I'll be in the company of old friends. And at that point, I will almost certainly start speaking, Scots, or at least Scots-English, a mixture of the Scots language and the English language. So a little bit of history now, because back it's how the language, and more than just the language, came from Scotland to Appalachia. So back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, around the time that Scotland and England came together as the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Ireland was a colony of England at the time. And there was a worry in the government in London at the time because most of the population of Ireland were Catholic. They were part of the Catholic Christianity, whereas Scotland and England by that time were very much Protestant. And the government in London were very worried about this Catholic population in Ireland. So what they did was they encouraged farmers, poor farmers from the north of England and the south of Scotland to move to the north of Ireland. And many people did. And at that point, they were termed planters. They were called planters. And the land that they took over, and here's the first word that came over here to the southern states of America, they were called plantations. And that's the first time we get the word plantation appearing, is in the north of Ireland. Now, those planters who arrived in the north of Ireland, most of them were from the south of Scotland. And of course, they weren't terribly popular with the local population in Ireland because they had taken over their land. So they settled, and then they had children, and their children became known as the Scotch-Irish, because they were born in Ireland, but their parents came from Scotland. And as they grew up, those children, they realised that there wasn't much for them in Ireland, and they weren't very popular. So a lot of them got into boats and came over here to America and wound up down here in Appalachia. So that's the Scotch-Irish. They wouldn't be called that in Ireland or even in Scotland. They would have been called Ulster Scots, because that part of Ireland is called Ulster. It's the north part of Ireland. So that's how they ended up down here. And I'm going to talk now a bit about what we find looking around and listening to people in this part of the world. And the first thing you notice And I noticed when I first moved here, which was about between 15 and 20 years ago, and moved to this part of America, I was already fascinated by the connection with songs, ballads, fiddle tunes, all of which I recognise as connecting back to Scotland, very often through Ireland, but sometimes directly from Scotland. And first of all, I noticed that particularly older people around here, a lot of the language that they used had connections back to Scotland. For instance, any word that ends in a G, like bringing or fetching or, connecting, the G gets missed off. So it becomes, bringing, fetching, connecting. There's no G on the end. And that's pure Scots. It's just so pronunciation is part of it. But then so is vocabulary is another part of it. Because my granddad, was a very pure Scots speaker. And he would never have spoken about a paper bag. The kind of paper bag that if you went to a corner shop, corner store, they would put something in that you were buying. He would always have called that a poke. And of course, that's a word that's used around here. Some of you will have heard the expression, don't buy a pig in a poke, don't buy something unseen. So, in fact, there's a funny story about that. I have a good friend who actually was the guy who first brought me to this part of America. And he lives down in Greenville in Tennessee. And when he first came to that area, he got a job in the local food city in the delicatessen, which is a very good cook. And one day, and it was in November, he was working there, and one of the young women who was working the checkout at the front of the store came to him and said there was an elderly gentleman down at the checkout, and he was asking for something that they thought was very rude. They thought he was being very rude, but they didn't quite understand what he was talking about. So she asked my friend to go down and see if he could work out what this old guy wanted. Well, it turned out that what he'd asked for was a turkey poke, a roasting bag, because it was November and it was getting close to Thanksgiving, and he was going to roast a turkey. And he was asking for a turkey poke. And of course, the young woman at the checkout thought he was being very rude, because to her, a poke was poking, whereas it was a paper bag. So one good example of the Scots language translating here into Appalachia. But there are lots of other connections, place names, family names. There's a place not too far from where you are all sitting right now called Dungannon. Now, Dungannon is a town in Ireland. Quite obviously, that's the connection. The people who first arrived here, they came down the wagon trail from Philadelphia. They all came down more or less where I-81 is now. But there was no I-81 then. And they came down in their horse-drawn wagons. And when they got down to this part of corner of Virginia, they looked around and they saw, the land, the topography, they looked very familiar. And they thought, this will do us. And they settled there. Some of them, of course, carried on all the way to Georgia. Some of them carried on over the Cumberland Mountains into Kentucky, but a lot of them stayed just around here. It's funny, I have a new mail woman that delivers our mail here in Wytheville, and she started on her round, including our house, a couple of days ago. And very pleasant young woman, and I happened to be out in the porch when she arrived, and she was looking at my mail and then looked up and said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "Are you Scottish?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And it turned out that she has Scottish names in her family background. So, you find it all over here. quite amazing. The names are interesting as well because some of them are very definitely from the Gaelic speaking part of Scotland, the west coast and the islands off the west coast of Scotland. And in those names, they all start with Mac or Mick, M-A-C or M-C. So Macpherson, Macintosh, that kind of thing. And Mac simply means the son of. But that part of Scotland, the very north and the west coast, for a long time, were ruled by the Vikings from Scandinavia. So you also find many names that end in son, S-O-N, which means the same thing as Mac. So instead of Macpherson, well, actually, Macpherson is a funny example because it's got a Mac at the beginning and it's got son at the end. So I guess it's saying son of person. It's a strange thing. You can trace those names either back to the Gaelic speaking part of Scotland or to the Viking part. And sometimes it can get confusing because if someone is around here is called Johnson without the T, with just John son, then that's Viking, and that simply means the son of John. But if it's Johnston with a T in it, then that's quite different. That is actually a variation on Johnstown. And that's the old name. The old name for Perth, the city of Perth in Scotland, is St. Johnstown, St. Johnston. And in fact, their local soccer team is still called St. Johnston. So if your name is Johnston, then it means that your ancestors came from near that part of Scotland. But if your name is Johnson, then it's a totally different background. It's very similar to Swedish Jensen, which is, the same thing. And again, it's back to the Vikings.
There will be lords and ladies there, but at you they'll stop and stare. You'd be the fairest, oh the fair, my bonny lassie.
So I'm completely fascinated by the kind of history that you can find just by looking at place names and family names. And of course, many of the names that you find they're not to do with where people came from. They're to do with what their ancestors did, their occupational names. So, if someone's called Cartwright, it means they made cartwheels. If they're called Carter, it means that one of their ancestors drove a cart. And they're actually an alleyway in St Andrews, in my home county of Fife, a very historic town. There's an alleyway and it's got two signs on the wall, one above the other. And one of them says Baker's Wynd. And the other one says Baxter's Close. And they both mean the same thing. The Scottish word for a baker is a Baxter. The Scottish name for an alleyway is a close. The English name for it is a wynd, W-Y-N-D. And there they are, the two signs, one above the other. I find it utterly, totally fascinating, just going back and finding out things like that. Now, I mentioned Mac and son meaning the same thing. And of course, you might be wondering if McIntyre, for instance, means the son of Mac. What if you're a girl? What if you're, a woman? What would you call yourself? Well, in Ireland now, which also has Mac and Mick at the beginning of their words, there's been quite a fashion over the last, 20 or 30 years of women changing from Mac at the beginning of their name to Nick, N-I-C, which means daughter of. And that's kind of interesting as well. It's how language actually evolves, even a language as strange as Gaelic, Scots Gaelic or Irish Gaelic. So we get back to the Scots language, which is, my natural language. When I was growing up, when I was a boy attending elementary school, primary school, we called it, but it's the same thing as elementary school here. I was very discouraged by my teachers from speaking Scots, certainly in the classroom, and even when we were out for a break in the playground. If you were heard speaking Scots, I know that in some places in Scotland, kids would be actually physically punished if they were heard speaking Scots. I was never physically punished, but I was certainly discouraged. And I don't blame the teachers because they honestly thought they were preparing you to succeed in life. And by their thinking, to succeed in life, you needed to speak proper, what they would call proper English, and not what they thought of as lazy English or, wrong English. They didn't recognize that it was a valid language to speak. Now, that has changed now, very much changed. There are now books being published for children in the Scots language. And in fact, my wife, Wendy, has been involved in that when she lived in Scotland. When we first got married, she was very involved with a man called Matthew Fitt, who published books for kids in Scots language. And Wendy was very involved in that. And I think here's another connection to Appalachia, because I know from talking to people here that the same thing happened here, that the kids in school here were, and I imagine maybe still are, discouraged from speaking their natural language, Appalachian English. And it's a bit sad because, there's nothing wrong with being multilingual and knowing different languages and using them, in appropriate times and places as they're required. And that's how I think about things. And I mentioned code switching earlier. If I'm up in New York or Washington or something like that, I will speak more slowly and more clearly, be a bit more careful about how I pronounce things. When I'm around here, I've been here long enough now that I tend to switch into elements of Appalachian English, depending on who I'm talking to. So it's not, it's not hard and it's not wrong. It's just using language appropriately. And I'm sure that's true in the very classroom that you're sitting in. If you're talking among yourselves and you're from this area, you're very likely to be speaking, some version of Appalachian English. But I'm sure that if you're, doing a presentation in the class to the rest of the class, you'll be, being a bit more careful about how you speak. So the other thing that I find interesting, and it's a connection between the part of Scotland that I come from. Now, I don't come from the Gaelic-speaking area in the west. I come from the area in the south of Scotland where the people that actually eventually wound up in Appalachia came from, so southern half of Scotland. And the area that I come from was, for a long time, a coal mining area. Many coal mines around the town that I was born in and grew up in. Mining villages, the equivalent over here would be called coal camps. And I know that I was, when I first came to Big Stone Gap and met some very interesting people who had a lot of knowledge about the local coal camps. And they took me out and they took me around and showed me many of them. And they reminded me enormously of the coal mining villages in my part of Scotland. Houses obviously looked a bit different because the weather can be rather different in Scotland from what it is here. So they were a bit more solidly built, the houses. But, a lot of the background was very similar. Back in the early 1900s and the 1800s, in those parts of Scotland with the coal mines, they had a company store, just like they had here. The house that you stayed in was owned by the coal company. You know, it was almost a form of indenture. You were tied. You were living in a tied house. You were tied to the coal mine and often paid in what was called scrip. So you could only spend the money you were given in the company store. So you were very much tied to it. And I saw enormous parallels here in Appalachia to that, tied to the coal mines and to that way of life. I was speaking about language earlier and talking about how much of the Scots language had come here. But funnily enough, even some of the Gaelic language came over here as well. And how that happened is actually quite interesting because those settlers that came here to Appalachia from the south of Scotland, there were Scots that came here 50 years earlier, and they were from the western part of Scotland. They were Gaelic speakers. They were Highlanders. And they came to the coastal part of the States, to North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And they were Gaelic speakers. Funnily enough, the last Gaelic speaker to die in North Carolina was in the late 1800s, over by the coast. He was a native Gaelic speaker. That was his first language. But he was a black minister of the church, a pastor. And it's not hard to work out how he ended up as a Gaelic speaker, because obviously his background was that he'd been a slave on a plantation that was either owned or managed by one of these Highlanders. And this kind of culminated in a clash between those Highlanders and the Lowlanders at a place called King's Mountain, right on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. The Battle of King's Mountain was during the War of Independence, the American War of Independence. And it was the British Army against the American settlers. Now, the British Army at that battle were those Highlanders dressed in tartan, in kilts, but part of the British Army. And against them were these settlers who originally came from lowland Scotland. Spoken to many people about this, and this Battle of King's Mountain is always taught in your schools, as the British against the settlers, the Americans. But in actual fact, it was simply yet another battle between Highlanders and Lowlanders, Scottish Highlanders and Scottish Lowlanders. They've been doing this for centuries. And they just happened to find themselves in America and carried on doing what they had always done. So it had more to do with that than it had to do with anything else. And I always wondered why. Why did these Highlanders side with the British government and support the British colonies when they had been more or less forced out of Scotland in the first place? And it turned out that they considered themselves to be high class. So they felt they were allied with the government in London and, the people who were in charge there. And they saw the settlers, the Scottish, the Scotch-Irish, as being very low class and below them. Another interesting connection between Scotland and Ireland and Appalachia. I spoke earlier about how the Scots language was a bit discouraged when I was going to elementary school. And this goes back into history as well. And again, it connects to why kids, young people in this area were discouraged as well. Because what happened was, before Scotland and England came together as, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, about 100 years earlier, Mary, Queen of Scots' son, King James VI of Scotland, he acceded to the English throne when Queen Elizabeth, the first Queen Elizabeth, died. And it's very ironic because, of course, she was the one that had Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded. And yet Mary's son, James VI, becomes James I of England. And he's the guy, you all know him because that's the guy of the King James Bible. So he paid for the Bible to be translated into English and made widely available. So that wound up in all the churches, including in Scotland. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland also signed up basically to the King James Bible. And in fact, the first public schools in Britain were in Scotland, and they were set up by the church, the Presbyterian Church. And the reason they were set up was to teach children how to read. And the reason they wanted them to read was so they could read the Bible. And it was the King James Bible.
When the dancing it's all done, my bonny lassie, oh, we will greet the rising sun, my bonny lassie, oh, with the curlew and the hair.
Now, at that point, Scots language stops being a written language and continues as a spoken language. And it develops over centuries in different parts of Scotland slightly differently. So if you go to Scotland, you will hear Scots language being spoken quite differently in Aberdeen, in Fife, in Glasgow, in Inverness, because it was spoken and not written from that point on. There are still books that can be found that are written in the Scots language that predate the King James Bible. They are all legal documents, and they're all books that judges would use in hearing cases that go back through law for a long way. And there's actually a good reason for that. And that's because the legal system in England is completely separate from the legal system in Scotland. And legal system in Scotland is based on Napoleonic law, the French law, whereas English law is based on the Magna Carta. It's very English. So, and that's continued up to the present day. That is still the case, that Scottish law is quite separate from English law. So some of these books that were written in the Scots language are still used by Scottish judges in deciding on cases. So that's quite interesting. The other thing I should probably touch on is people get very confused about the difference between England, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the British Isles. Most people in America, when they think about, if they think about it at all, they will refer to England, meaning the whole thing. And of course, it's not the whole thing. The full title of the country is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. A big mouthful. Great Britain is the bit that consists of Scotland, England, and Wales. So that's Great Britain. It becomes the United Kingdom when you add in Northern Ireland, which is still part of United Kingdom. And then, of course, the other half of Ireland is the Republic of Ireland, which is a completely separate, independent country. But that island of Ireland that is split, that is actually part of the geographical term, the British Isles. So the British Isles are Great Britain, all the various islands round about it, plus the island of Ireland. So all very confusing. And just to make things even more confusing, when United Kingdom takes part in the Olympic Games, they're always referred to as GB, Great Britain, which is a bit sad for the people from Northern Ireland who are also part of the team that competes. They're not recognised. It's all rather confusing. It's not just the law in Scotland that continued to be, separate from English law. There are quite a few other things that have remained separate ever since the early 1700s. Not just the legal system, but the official church is different. The school system, university system is different. Qualifications that people get at school or at university, colleges are quite different. The health service, the National Health Service in Scotland has always been quite separate from the English and the Welsh and the one in Northern Ireland. May interest you to know that prescriptions, doctors' prescriptions in Scotland are free, completely free, whereas you have to pay for them in England. So quite a lot of differences still. It's not, and then the other thing you need to know is that the population is very unevenly split. So something like 85% of the United Kingdom population is in England. And I think about 12% in Scotland, and the rest split between Wales and Northern Ireland. So it's, and it causes quite a bit of, I wouldn't go so far as to say tension, but there's an awareness, particularly in Scotland, that it's different from England, even though the countries have been joined under one parliament for 300 years, more than 300 years. But there's still a very strong sense of Scottishness in Scotland. And even people who come there, from elsewhere, who immigrants from somewhere else, pretty quickly feel Scottish. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we have in Scotland, quite a lot of people from China, Pakistan, India, Poland, Eastern Europe. It's quite amusing to hear people from, say, Pakistan speaking with a Scots accent. It's, again, language and the way language travels across the world. Now, the interesting thing about Wales, it's also one of the Celtic nations, and I haven't actually mentioned that so far, but, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, the Isle of Man, which is halfway between England and Ireland, Cornwall, right down in the southwest of England, Brittany in northwest France, they are all recognised as Celtic nations because they have languages that are related and are quite different from English, utterly different from English. So Scotland and England were independent countries before they came together in 1707. But Wales was never, it's an independent, complete country.
She sang sae clear, my bonny lassie. Oh. We will bless yon leafy bower, my bonny lassie. Or we spent the midnight hour, my bonny lassie. Oh, we will bless yon leafy bower.
So when we were in Ireland, one of the things we were told was that there were these programs in place to revive Irish Gaelic, Irish language. They're planting students, college students in the South with families, native speakers. There's only 20% of the population speaks it. Do you know of similar programs in Scotland?
Yes. Both the UK government, oddly enough, and the Scottish government actually provide funding to encourage Gaelic speakers and Gaelic speaking. Now, one of the things that's happened is there are now schools established in the Lowlands, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, I think in Dundee as well, primary schools, elementary schools that teach completely in Gaelic. And there's been quite a resurgence of people learning it as a second language because they want to, there are some very popular music groups around, Capercaillie and, groups like that, pop groups, very good pop groups who all their songs in Gaelic. So quite a lot of people, younger people particularly, are learning Gaelic so they can understand the songs. So it wouldn't be their first language. But if you go to the Western Isles, I mean, a couple of years ago, the last time I did a tour over there, it was the what we call the Highlands and Islands tour. And we went to the island of Lewis, which is it's the biggest of the Hebrides Islands off the west coast of Scotland. And walking about in the main town there, you would hear people in the street, gossiping and talking in Gaelic. That was their first language. But interestingly enough, there are more people speaking Gaelic as a first language in Nova Scotia, in Canada, Cape Breton, more speaking it as a first language than in the whole of Scotland. And in fact, that all goes back to what I said earlier about King's Mountain. Because when those Highlanders were defeated in the Carolinas, a lot of them were taken prisoner. And after the Revolutionary War and America's independence, instead of going back to where they'd come from on the coast of the Carolinas, they went to Canada because Canada was still a British colony. And that's where they went, and that's where they settled. So that's why there are so many Gaelic speakers in Canada rather than in Scotland. But no, in answer to your question, Amy, it was, yes, it is being encouraged. There's actually a very good TV channel in Scotland called Alba, and it's partly funded by the Scottish government, and it's partly funded by the BBC, amazingly. And all its programmes are in Gaelic, very often with English subtitles, so you can follow along if you don't speak Gaelic. But if you're interested at all, then it's worth checking them out. They'll have lots of programmes on YouTube. And you can put in BBC Alba or just Alba TV, and you'll be able to find them.
BEN. Isn't that Gaelic for mountain? Didn't you tell me that before?
Well, it's usually short for Benjamin, but but if his name is just Ben, yeah. And there's an interesting story about that as well. Yes, Ben is a mountain. Glen, of course, is a valley. But I mentioned earlier about the different Celtic languages. There were different versions of Gaelic spoken in Scotland. The version in the west of Scotland is very closely related to Irish Gaelic. But the southern part of Scotland, from, about Perthshire down to the English border, and there are lots of place names that reflect this, their version of Gaelic was much more closely related to Welsh. And the Welsh word for a mountain isn't ben, it's pen, like you would write with pen. And there's a town just outside Edinburgh in the south of Scotland called Pennycook. And that's a very good example of what I'm talking about. Pen, meaning hill or mountain, Pen, it's a Y. And in Scotland, it's an I, but it would be a Y in Wales. And cook is a Scots word for a cuckoo, Cuick. So Pennycook means the hill of the cuckoos, but it's more related to Welsh than it is to west of Scotland Gaelic. We even have place names that you can trace back to the even older Pictish language of Scotland. When the Romans came, they never got very far up into Scotland, and they described the natives there as the Picts. And language again, because that comes from the same root as picture or painting. And the Picts, because they had designs on their bodies painted on in what was called woad, W-O-A-D. And so they had, if you like, tattoos on their skin. So the Romans called them Picts. But we know very little about them, although if you've heard of standing stones, carved stones that you find all over Scotland with odd designs carved into them. And these were the Picts that did that. But you also find it in place names. I used to live in a very small hamlet called Pit Liver. And Pit is Pictish for a place, P-I-T. So Pit, so you find lots of places in Scotland with names that start P-I-T, and that's back to the Picts again. But Pit Liver is interesting because it's a mixture of Latin and Pictish, because there's a very ancient abbey close by where I lived in Dunfermline, a Norman abbey going back to the 1000s, and the monks the books were very, very important and valuable to them. Handwritten, obviously, books back then. And they couldn't keep them in the abbey because if the Vikings came, they would steal the books and anything else they could find. So they had their library away from the abbey where they kept the books. And that's what was where I used to live. And liver, pit liver, Liver, was simply a variation of liber, Liber, which is where you get library from. So language, I'm fascinated by the way language changes in over the years.
My bonny lassie, gen you'll gone to Fordobo, I would dress you like a dog. You'd be the flute